The issue of development policy review, which we're launching here, is a book of reprints. There are articles which have been published in DPR over the period since about 2003, but it's a selection around the theme of aid, institutions and governance. And the basic argument of my introduction is that these articles reflect how much has been learned in this field over the last 20 years or so. The issue is celebrating ODI's anniversary. It's celebrating DPR as a journal, but it's also in this meeting a means of persuading all of you that the Africa Power and Politics programme is the programme which is answering the big questions about aid, institutions and development. The last of the reprinted articles is the article by Tim called "Going with the Grain in African Development?" and that's what he's going to respond to. One of the other pieces is in fact co-authored by Sue Unsworth and Alex Duncan, who's sitting over here. So there are a number of different things coming together here. I'm not going to try to sort of summarize my introductory piece, but just to pull out one or two headlines from it. The opening argument is that in the field of development policy and ideas about development, there's an awful lot of cyclical change. In many areas of development thinking, we come back about every 10 years to the same position. And there's not very much progress. And I think that's true of a good number of the main topics in economic policy thinking. But there are some exceptions to this. There are some areas of development thinking in which there is real progress. And it seems to me, I mean, the argument of the piece is that this is a case of cumulative evidence generation and thinking. We have learned a series of things. And right now, I just want to give you a few sort of headlines about what the articles argues we have learned. I've got 4 bits of learning about institutions, 2 about policies in institutions, and 4 about ownership, country ownership of development aid and development effectiveness. And in each of these areas, I think we've learned a lot in the last 20 years and quite a lot in the last 10 years. About institutions, in the words of the famous article by Danny Roderick and others, institutions rule. If your starting point is the literature which does regression analysis on large statistical data sets, the relationship between institutions and development outcomes is far more strong and far stronger and far more robust than most of the other relationships that have been examined. It's a lot stronger than the relationship between aid and development outcomes, and much more robust. Secondly, another theme that's been most effectively argued by Roderick, we don't really know which are the right institutions to assist economic and political institutions to assist countries to develop fast, particularly since the recent growth of China. It is clear that there are certain functions that need to be performed by institutions in the process of development, but it isn't at all clear that those functions need to be performed by the institutions which are established well in highly developed countries. And in particular, third point, the institutions that are promoted by the good governance agenda of the donors, the best practices in institutional development that are promoted by the World Bank, are a particularly misleading guide to the sorts of institutions which are needed to get very poor countries up to the point of being somewhat less poor countries. This is an argument that's been made most effectively by Mushtaq Khan. And finally, on institutions, institutions are seldom the product of conscious design. They usually spin off from political processes, and often, particularly clear in the Asian case, they incorporate substantial elements from the pre-modern institutional culture of countries. That last point relates to the going with the grain theme, which Tim will be talking about. That's institutions. That's all fairly standard stuff, I think. Although the Roderick version is more recognised than the Mushtaq Khan version. Two things about policies and institutions, which are perhaps not so well established. First, policies really matter. It really matters which policies are pursued by the governments of poor developing countries. My principal source here is a very good Dutch project at the University of Leiden called Tracking Development, which has demonstrated quite irrefutably by comparing Southeast Asian countries and African countries that whether or not countries adopt early on a rural biased public investment policy and a smallholder biased institutional framework, whether or not they do that is the crucial explanatory factor behind the major divergences in development performance between African countries and similar Southeast Asian countries. Policies really do matter. Institutions matter partly because of the ways in which they frame policy choices. Two aspects of this here. I mean, one is that what matters is the real policies, not the formally declared policies. And there's a very good piece declared and agreed with the donors. Tony Killick's recently reprinted book on Ghana has some very good material on the degree to which the actual policies are shaped by the institutions of the country and not by the declarations that countries make about their policies. But secondly, and even more crucially, the institutional makeup of the political regime in power makes a huge difference to which policies get picked up. So whether good policies in the tracking development sense are adopted or not is a function of the political regime in power. And this is one of the streams of work that we're working on very intensively in the Africa Power and Politics programme, looking at the diversity of different kinds of institutional arrangement that political regimes in Africa have had since independence. And we're exploring the hypothesis that alongside neo-patrimonial clientelistic regimes which are purely predatory and have very negative effects on development, there are also neo-patrimonial regimes which are developmental in their impact, and that much more attention needs to be given to looking at those experiences, partly because they too are very close to what we know about what has worked for development in Asia. Finally, 4 things about ownership, aid and development effectiveness. The quantitative regression analysis studies of the impact of aid, the aid growth relationship, become more and more inconclusive as each year goes past. And that's in sharp contrast, I think, to the evidence that country ownership and various sort of institutional factors bound up with this idea of country ownership of development efforts are really powerful and absolutely critical determinants of development outcomes. This was recognized 10 or 12 years ago when the poverty reduction strategy paper idea was being born, and the idea that country ownership is crucial is still there in the Paris Declaration process. None of the evidence that supported that rethink has gone away. But, well, first of all, PRSPs didn't do the trick. And there are two pieces in here which I would cite in evidence of that. It isn't possible for donors to engineer country ownership by making new conditionalities around planning processes like poverty reduction strategy papers. Third point on this, the lesson to be drawn from that, I would argue, is that we need to become much more sophisticated in understanding the sources of country-owned development efforts. We do not need to go back to the era of believing that conditionalities work to buy reforms and get the kind of policies that the donors approve of. And there's at least one piece in here which is discussing the current trend back to what is taken as more and more sophisticated, clever forms of conditionality, the piece by Art Goldsmith. What we need instead, and this is my sort of final point, is to understand much, much better the way political systems in poor developing countries work, and the ways in which it might be possible to nudge along, assist in a very light way, processes which have promise in terms of producing developmentally effective political regimes. One way to put that is to say that the argument of Sue Unsworth's little book, Upside Down Governance, is absolutely right. We've got to become, if we're serious about improving development results and understanding what kind of governance structures lead to better governance results, we need to turn our thinking upside down in an important respect. We need to stop promoting the institutions of advanced industrial countries as solutions to the problems of very poor countries. We need to begin with their realities instead. The other way to put this would be to say, with reference to Africa in particular, we need to be thinking about how to work with the grain of the local realities, which is the title, as it happens, of Tim Kelsall's piece, which brings this volume to what I think is a very satisfactory close.
Thank you very much, David. Well, that's definitely